is that the problem most people face is not the amount of motivation that they feel, because the truth is, every voluntary action that we perform requires motivation. It doesn't matter if it's good, bad, or indifferent. You have to feel motivation, otherwise you won't do anything. And I could even argue that choosing not to do anything still requires motivation because there's a choice there.
Brady, welcome to the show and thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Since we were chatting before the show and I told you I'm in Ireland, and obviously because I live in the country of Georgia and my habits I have the habits that I take with me everywhere, which is like working out every single day. No matter where I go, I find the gym. I have my weights here. I have my yoga mat. That's what I take everywhere I go. But my habits have changed. And this is so interesting that there are habits you take everywhere you go with you. But then there are habits that you move to a different place and you realize that like things go in a different way. Maybe you start to sleep in, you go to bed late. So I was wondering, like, obviously I'm enjoying this habit, which is working out, but how can I change my life and my habits in a way that wherever I go, what's important for me always stays with me? And you are the best person to talk about the habits and motivation and how we can basically become the person that we want and adopt the habits that we want, that wherever we go, and I'm not saying obviously people go to vacations, some things will change, but there are things that we don't want to change. So for you personally, do you have any practice or any process to create the habits that is engraved, or am I just completely thinking in a wrong way and you just have to adopt new habits wherever you go?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great lead in, and I appreciate the kind words. I don't know if I would say I'm the best person to talk about habits and goals, but I'll certainly try to provide insight that is valuable. So I think that you have your habits, but your habits are not an end in themselves. They are a means to an end. And I think that if you evaluate your habits on a deeper level, you get to bigger questions about things like your identity and your purpose and your key values. And you have to let those things inform the habits that you have and not the other way around. So I have a background in church leadership. I did 5 years of ministry. And I remember reading a book when I was in ministry by a guy named Carey Nieuwhof. So Carey Nieuwhof was a pastor for a long time. Now he works in the realm of leadership and self improvement. And in writing one time about the church, he said that with church, your mission is always the same, but the method changes based on time and context. And I think that's a principle that applies to our lives as well. So, a lot of us, we have a purpose, we have a desire, we have an outcome that we're pursuing for the end of our life. And in most cases, that doesn't change. It may evolve over time as you learn more about yourself and as you begin to see the world around you differently. But for the most part, that's consistent. Now, the habits that you practice to help you reach that destination, those can change based on the season of life that you're in, based on the different demands that you have on your time, but they are still designed to help you reach that end goal. And I think that in order to apply this, you have to get really clear about what you care most about, and you have to make sure that you're not confusing things that are a means to an end with the end itself. So let's talk about fitness, for example, because you talked about how you're always working out, and that's a habit that you take with you regardless of where you are. I'm the same way. I've realized that that's a keystone habit for me in a way. It sort of informs or dictates a lot of the other things that I'm doing. Now, we can agree that working out is important, but we can also acknowledge that there are many ways to accomplish that. You can go for a run, you can lift weights, you can do yoga. There are lots of means to that end that is working out. I think the problem that a lot of people face is they get so lost in the particular method or application of working out that they lose track of the goal that they're pursuing. For example, maybe someone thinks in order to work out, in order to get in shape, I have to go for runs, but I really don't like running. I would rather go play pickleball. My neighbors really enjoy pickleball, and that's a great form of exercise for them. There are a lot of ways that you can reach that end goal, but if you get so trapped in the particular application, then you can lose track of where you're headed.
So as I'm hearing you say, it's important to create these habits, but we have to also be flexible, like disciplined and flexible at the same time. So we are not like really, if something changes, then yes, it's good to have the goals and habits, but they don't have to control us in a way. We have to take control over them. So for something, yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say it's important to acknowledge we have goals, but we don't work for our goals. The goals work for us. The purpose of a goal is to help you get to the place where you want to go or to have the kind of life that you want to live. And if you recognize that a goal is not serving you in that way anymore, you're better off ditching that goal and choosing a new one than just continuing to pursue the goal, even when you realize that it doesn't have the same value that it had to offer before.
Some people go on with their life. For example, they know they have to graduate from the school, then it's the university, then they get the job, and they don't even think about their own habits. They go to the work, they come back, they spend time with the TV or social media, and that's it. And they feel satisfied, as it seems like from outside. Do you think everyone should change their habits, or is it like just for only the people who have other goals than achieving something else? Because sometimes people can be disconnected. They don't
Hmm.
even know they have passion. They don't even know they have goals. So how would you guide people? Because they're listening and they're like, you know what, I'm enjoying my life. Like, I don't want to be a president. Why should they change their habits and monitor their goals and think about motivation at all?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point. Whether we realize it or not, we all have habits. Our brains are neurologically hardwired to conserve energy whenever possible, and that's what habits do. As you repeat an action over time, your brain begins to recognize there is a predictable process and outcome. And that's really what a habit is. You perform a certain action, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, the same outcome results. And then over time, as repetition happens, your brain begins to associate that action with that outcome. And so those habits can serve you, they can benefit you, or they can knock you off track and prevent you from getting where you want to go. So, to answer your question, for the person that says, well, I don't want to be president or I don't want to, accomplish whatever lofty goal it might be, my question would be, okay, well, then what do you want? Are you happy with not only where you are, but the direction where you're headed? I think it's Craig Groeschel that often says your system is perfectly designed for the results that you're currently experiencing. And so, if you want to continue to practice the same habits and repeat the same actions, that's fine. Nothing is ever going to change. So, you better be 100% happy with the way that things currently are, because if you continue to do the same things, then you can't expect different results. And I think that, just to add one more thing, awareness is important for everyone. You have to have an understanding of not only what your current habits are, but what sort of direction they're headed. Because, like, I think of the example, maybe you eat a lot of junk food, or maybe you're not like reading or expanding your knowledge at all right now, and you're not seeing any negative results in the moment, so you think that that's fine. But you have to also consider not just how that impacts you right now, but how that will impact you over time. If you continue to do something negative, or even something that is neutral, it doesn't have any good or bad benefit, if you continue to do that for a prolonged period of time, that may compound into an effect or an outcome that is greater than what you're currently experiencing.
You're completely right. Sometimes people just go with the flow. They don't even think they can have other desires because that's how they were raised, that they just watch their parents do the same. And the question, if they ask themselves, what, even sometimes, like, what if my life can be different? Like, then asking the right questions are so important. I was always fascinated by motivation and goals, but sometimes I can get lost because there are so many things about motivation and about goal setting and about habits. Where do we start? Where is the baby step to like connect to ourselves? Because just journal, write down these 10 things you want to achieve and have the system, and like you can get overwhelmed. So if I'm the person and I'm like, you know what, I really want to create change in my life. I don't enjoy where I am. I have no idea what I want yet, but I know I have to change something. Where do I start?
Mhm. Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. So, what is informing a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is this desire that I have to make the entry point for motivation as easy as possible. And I feel strongly about this because I've realized we all have the same amount of motivation. I wouldn't have said that if you talked with me 10, 15 years ago. I probably would have told you that success was predestined, like it was something that some people were lucky enough to experience and others just weren't as fortunate. But over time, as I began to adopt some of these small daily habits, kind of like we were talking about before, I eventually recognized I have more control over my life than I think. And that sense of agency that I felt for the first time pushed me and empowered me to do things that I wouldn't have thought were possible before. And the lesson that I've learned even more recently, going back to motivation, is that the problem most people face is not the amount of motivation that they feel. Because the truth is, every voluntary action that we perform requires motivation. It doesn't matter if it's good, bad, or indifferent. You have to feel motivation. Otherwise, you won't do anything. And I could even argue that choosing not to do anything still requires motivation because there's a choice there. So, again, the problem is not how much motivation you have, but it is the direction or the focus of your motivation. And most of the tough choices that we face in life, or I won't even say tough choices, but a lot of the daily choices that we face involve competing motivations. The example that I've used frequently is, I work long days. I usually start pretty early and then I finish around 5 p.m. like most people, but I get to the end of the day, I'm tired, I'm ready for bed, but I have two young children. And so I have to make the choice. Am I going to disengage? Am I going to sit and scroll through social media on my phone? Am I going to get lost in whatever baseball or basketball game is playing on TV? Or am I going to put forth the extra effort to be with them, play with them, engage with them? And there's a choice that I have to make there. And both choices have their own not only motivation attached, but there's also a cost and a reward associated with each. And I think that a good first step for anyone is to acknowledge that those things exist, to acknowledge you feel pushed or pulled in multiple directions. And whatever choice you take has something to offer, but it's also going to require something of you in return. And the last thing that I'll add for this, I talked earlier about how our brains are hardwired to conserve energy. Your brain also prefers the short term outcome because it's more certain. And so you think about like the person who wants to get up early before their workday starts to go to the gym, but they struggle with staying in bed or hitting snooze on their alarm. In a way, you were predisposed to hit snooze and go back to sleep because it's an immediate reward. Your brain says, you want to stay in bed, you want to be under the warm blanket. Like that is, the short term reward again. But there is also more of a long term cost, whether it's the opportunity cost or wasted potential. And so, in order to find motivation, we kind of talked about this earlier with determining, your focus or your purpose or the, long term outcome that you desire. You have to get really clear about that and look for ways to remind yourself not just where you are today, but where you want to be tomorrow. And once you have a really clear picture of that, you can begin to create the discipline and imagine the steps that it will take to help you get where you want to go.
Is it almost like imagining the person you want to be and like being it as you wake up, just being that person?
Hmm.
Or is it more like what is the question? Because you were saying like becoming the person or being the person. So is it like the question, what would the person I want to become do in this moment? Or is it just like having the goal and then showing up? What's the process in the brain? Because when you wake up, it's easy to talk about all of these things, but then
Hmm.
someone is like, okay, like I know my what my brain is doing, but how do we still, what is the like self-talk, what is the questions we can ask to ourselves? For me, I just imagine how would I feel after doing certain things, and I have almost
Hmm.
like reservoir in my brain of all the evidence of how
Hmm.
there have been these moments when didn't want to do something, but I knew I would have felt better and I actually felt better, and then I just feel that feeling, almost connect to that feeling good as if it already happened, and then it
Hmm.
motivates me. What is this process for you personally, or what are some questions people can ask themselves in the
Hmm.
process, in the moment?
Yeah, so I think even in asking that question, you acknowledged a few things about the process of motivation and decision making that are really important. We talked earlier about how essentially a habit, the way our brains interpret habits is guaranteed repeatable outcomes. And so I'll explain this with a story. So, a big part of my history, if you want to call it that, is struggling with obesity and overeating tendencies. And when I started college, there was never like a rock bottom, come to Jesus type moment where I realized that I needed to change my life and my habits. But gradually, I had some friends that were going to the gym. And so I just decided to tag along with them. It was easy. They lived, I had a roommate that was doing this. I had a friend down the hall that was doing this. And so the thought process for me was just, well, if they're going to be, in the gym, maybe I should do that too. And then over time, it became something that I was, able to do on my own. It just became consistent. But I remember a day a few months in where I was thinking to myself, I just don't want to go. Like, I'm tired. I'd rather do something else. I don't feel like working out today. And I don't remember the thought process behind it, but I forced myself to go anyways. And I remember feeling so good afterwards, not just physically because there's a release of endorphins, but also mentally, psychologically. It could have had something to do with the fact that I did something I didn't want to do and therefore locked in that motivation or that identity associated with being someone who, exercises and does hard things. But it felt so good that it was a feeling that I wanted to chase. And I think too, apply that situation to what we're talking about here, there's almost something neurological that happened where there's this shift from if I go to the gym, I'm going to feel tired, I'm going to feel frustrated and uncomfortable, to if I go to the gym, I'm going to feel really good afterwards. It might be tough in the moment, but after I do it, I'm going to be so glad that I made that choice. And so, in all of this, I want to make another point, which was inspired by what you were saying before. In a lot of these circumstances, the biggest obstacle that we face is our own self talk. We all, whether we realize it or not, have thoughts in our heads that are dictated by our past experiences or our perception of the world around us. And so if we can figure out how to change these thoughts, and I'm going to recommend one of my favorite books here, Soundtracks by John Acuff. John is one of my favorite authors, speakers, and so he wrote a book about how we can take charge of our overthinking and use it to be something that pushes us forward rather than something that holds us back. And so he unpacks this idea in greater detail in this book. But essentially, you can take these false narratives or these limiting beliefs and reorient them to be something that pushes you forward. So in the morning, when your alarm goes off and you don't want to wake up, your self talk could change from, I'm lazy, I'm not motivated, I always stay in bed, to I'm going to, and this is off the top of my head, so you could probably choose better language to put with this, but I'm going to make the first choice towards a productive or a beneficial day, something kind of like that. And as you have these thoughts more consistently, as you recognize through repetition that outcome to be true, it's going to lock in that new form of thinking, which again informs your action in a way that is more consistent, more repeatable. And this is, I'm rambling, but I'm getting excited here. This is something that a lot of people don't realize initially with discipline and motivation, is that you may feel a current level of motivation, or for a lot of people, a lack of motivation and discipline, but it's something that can transform over time. I said on a podcast, one of my own last week, that there is a difference between capability and predisposition. And so maybe you're predisposed to look for the easy way out, or you're predisposed to not do hard things, but that doesn't mean that you don't have the capacity to transform, to move forward, to be different as far as your tendencies go 6 months or a year from now than where you are today. But the only way to get there is to take that first step and look to build some consistency even when it feels awkward and unnatural.
It seems to me like a lot of this is connected to building the self trust, because if you say something and you are doing it, if you set out to have these goals and you achieve those goals, you build like self-trust. And when you have the trust in yourself, you know what, no matter what comes into your life, you can do it. For example, here my sleep schedule is off, but I know that if I have a bigger purpose in my life, if I'm back with my toddler, I can go back to waking up earlier and going back early because I know I have trust in myself. So self trust, have you thought about it, like how people, even like anything I start, before I didn't have that self trust in myself, but because of working out, because of any other different things, I know that no matter what I want to achieve, I will achieve that. But there is this different question that comes up, like you were talking about toddlers, and I myself have a toddler, you are a father, and sometimes i I know a lot of parents don't talk about it, but sometimes we don't want to play. Sometimes we don't want to, it's not that we don't love them. We have responsibilities in our lives, but we don't always want to fulfill those responsibilities. It's easier to get ourselves motivated for the things that we want to do. But what do we do when it's not like we have to do things, but we all have in our lives responsibilities that wouldn't be our first priority to do it. Sometimes I'm
Mhm.
with my toddler and I want to edit the podcast episode. And I'm like, I have my own process of being present and putting him to bed and like being fully present with him and then going back to what I want to do. But I find it harder to motivate myself to do something like that. And there are other examples in my life rather than just like anything else. So, what do we do when we have to do something but we don't want to do, but we think that it's necessary to do it?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that we need to do is acknowledge that we do not have to have 100% motivation to do something, and very rarely is that the case. I can think of few, if any, instances where I have gone for a run and I have felt 100% motivation to go for that run. And I run pretty often. I run 4, sometimes 5 times a week. But anytime I'm thinking about running, there's other things that I can do. Sometimes I'll go run in the afternoon when my kids are down for a nap, and I'll think, well, I want to take a nap too, or I want to watch this episode of this TV show that I've been watching, or I want to, do something else besides going out for a run. But I don't need to feel 100% motivation to do that. All I need to feel is more motivation than I feel to do anything else. And so when we recognize that, it becomes not necessarily about eliminating those other motivations because maybe that's not possible, but tipping the scales in favor to achieve our desired outcome. And so I think that knowing what will do that requires knowing yourself and knowing what motivates you most. So for me, I'm motivated in a lot of cases by accountability. If I tell someone that I am going to do something, it increases the pressure because what if I don't do it and I have to go back and tell that person that, hey, I said I was going to do this and I didn't do it. And maybe that, says something about me that I'm motivated by others' perception and how they see me, which is not good or bad. I think it's something that's inherent. It's obviously something that I need to be aware of. But in this example, it's something that I can take and use to my advantage. I'm also motivated by the potential for a reward later on. And maybe this is counterproductive, but I use the MyFitnessPal app to log my calories. So, say for example, I go for a 7 or 8 mile run. That's probably close to 1,000 calories burned. And so before, maybe I wouldn't have had the additional calories to have like an ice cream later on in the day. But because I go running, I free up those calories to where I can have that dessert or I can have that extra slice of pizza and still meet my goals for my calories. And this is a system that I've built for myself over time. So it's a little easier for me to perceive and understand in the moment. But again, these are examples of things where maybe that doesn't shift me from 0% to 100% to do that action, but it can add 10%. And again, the goal is not to get to 100%, but the goal is to get to a majority, whether that's 51% or 45% compared to, 3 or 4 different outcomes. But if you can think about simple ways to tip the scales in favor of completing whatever action it is or taking that next step, then all of a sudden you're going to feel a greater drive to act that didn't exist before.
I think one of the quotes, who said it? is movement manifests motivation. And
Hmm.
I love that because when you put on those running shoes and you just don't have to overthink, and after you have those moments, you get motivated. So you mentioned systems, you mentioned habits, you mentioned goals. Which one comes first? Like which one is the first thing, and then how, in my mind, something is first and we build out of it. Something
Hmm.
creates systems, like then habits create the systems. Or is it for you personally? Which one comes first?
Yeah,
Habit, goal, system?
yeah, and I would almost, I guess, in a roundabout way to answer your question, I would almost reword it to not what comes first, but what should you focus most on? Because I think that if the question is simply, what do you do first, it would probably be long term goals. Where do you want to be? And here's another Craig Rochelle quote. Any given podcast that you listen to with me on it, Craig Rochelle, John Acuff, James Clear will probably come up at least once. But Craig Rochelle often says people will grossly overestimate what they can do in the short term, but grossly underestimate what they can do in the long term. So you might have a goal for the next 3 months that is completely outrageous and unrealistic. But at the same time, you may not even come close to scratching the surface of what you could accomplish in 5 years' time through simple, repeatable actions. So I would say what you need to do first is you need to imagine yourself way off in the future. So I'm going to be 30 this year, which is kind of crazy to imagine. But if I were, and I'll probably do this at some point anyways, but if I were to sit down and think about, the direction for my life, I might imagine myself at 65, like the age when people typically retire, and ask questions about where do I want to be at that point in my life. And I would get really specific about individual domains. I wouldn't just think about it in an entirely broad sense, but I would think about, my work, my family, my other relationships, my physical health, my financial well being. And I would imagine the ideal in each of those scenarios. And then from there, I would work backwards to think, okay, if I want to, be the best father to my children, and that's kind of maybe not the best example because it's a little ambiguous. Let's say that my goal by the time I turn 65 is to have enough to retire and have a specific income each month from retirement. That's great. What do I need to do today and what do I need to do repeatedly over time to help myself reach that goal? You have these big, massive goals that you think about well into the future, and they may seem, too lofty or unattainable. But if you can break them down into steps that you take, maybe it's once a month, maybe it's once a year, maybe it's every day, but all of a sudden, climbing the mountain doesn't seem that hard when you think about it in terms of individual steps. So to answer the question that you asked, what should I focus on first? I think it's those long-term goals. What should I spend more time focusing on? I think it's the systems. And this is where James Clear Atomic
Talks
Habits
about,
comes
yeah.
into play. Yeah, I think it was pretty revolutionary in terms of thinking about how we approach habits. But James Clear talks about how instead of focusing on goals on a consistent basis, you have to focus on systems, because systems are not only what makes your goals more likely to happen, but it's what makes them more attainable. If your goal is to make $1 million, that sounds challenging. But if your goal is to, start at a monthly income of 3,000 and increase that by 10% every year, all of a sudden it seems a little more attainable. And you can break down, what does that 10% growth look like? What am I going to have to do? Where am I going to have to invest my time and energy in order to make that more likely to happen? So that was a long explanation. I would say start with goals, but focus more on your systems on an ongoing basis.
How can we also remember about the small habits that are important on day-to-day life? Because you're talking about breaking them down, and I have been
Mhm.
a victim of focusing on the huge goals, but then how you do anything is how you do everything. So
Mhm.
is it like being consistent with drinking your water or whatever it is in your life? Like you just do things in the same way, no matter how big and small. And how do you personally don't lose the track of the small things in your life and not only focus on these big goals?
Mhm. So I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, I think that people shy away from this type of application because it not only seems easy, but it seems boring. It seems inconsequential, but you have to realize what it's adding up to in the long run. James Clear, the idea of atomic habits, he talks about getting 1% better every day. And that's marginal on any given day. Some days it may seem consequential, it may seem not. But if you do that, not even every day, because everyone's going to slip up. I have days where I don't follow my diet. I have days where I don't read, where I don't move forward in my key goals. So you don't even have to be perfect. But let's say that 2/3 of the time you accomplish whatever daily goal you have. That's 66% in a given year. That's probably around 200, 250 days. I haven't taken math since high school, so I can't do that mental math in my head. But imagine if you were able to get 1% better 200 days in the year. All of a sudden you're going to be 200% better this time next year than where you are today. And the only thing separating you from that accomplishment is consistency. And it can be mundane, it can be repetitive, but it's truthfully what sets successful people apart from unsuccessful people. We live in a world where you can go viral overnight by putting the right video on social media or by being in the right place at the right time. And I think that it's caused people to fall into this trap of thinking that that's how people get to the top. But that is the exception and not the rule. You talk with anyone who has started a successful business, anyone who has made it to the highest stage as an athlete or a performer or whatever it might be. And they're not going to talk about their big break. They're going to talk about what they were doing consistently for long hours when no one was watching and how those things prepared them for the accomplishment that they ultimately reached.
Can we talk about, obviously, you don't have to if you don't want to, but your personal morning and night routine? Because I'm always curious to gain something new. And I'm really good with the
Hmm.
morning routine, but my night routine is not there yet.
Hmm.
So, what's your personal, like, obviously, you have toddlers, some days are different, but what is something that you always do in the morning and what is something that you always do at night?
Hmm. So, always in the morning, I always get up before my children because it's important to me to begin my day on my own terms. I am a little bit obsessive in terms of how I spend my time, how I manage my tasks. And I have found that if I begin the day in a proactive way, getting to do something that is important to me, it puts me in a much better frame of mind for the rest of the day. If I have to begin my day in a more responsive way, whether it's, my 4-year old, at the side of my bed telling me that it's time to get up or responding to whatever it is that he wants me to do, I guess I lose that sense of control or that sense of agency that enables me to do, these other things that I feel like are important. So I think that it's beginning that day with a sense of control. I also, and this applies more to the night than the morning, but I think that it influences the way that you start the day. I always try to plan my day to some extent, and that doesn't mean that I get entirely discouraged or frustrated if that plan doesn't happen, but I think that too many people expect success to happen accidentally, and so they get up and they respond to whatever requests other people make of them, or they just see where the day leads. And to some extent that's okay, but I also think that if you aim at nothing, you'll hit nothing. And so I always try to have some sort of idea of what I want to do or what I want to accomplish each day. And that normally happens the night before because, quite honestly, I'm harder on myself the night before than I am the morning of. Let's say that one of my goals for the day is, I'm training for a triathlon later this year. So I'm swimming laps in the pool right now. That is something that I'm less likely to do if I commit to it in the morning than if I commit the night before, because in the morning those thoughts start entering my head about, the water is cold, you can't touch the bottom, you're going to have to tread water. Like, that feeling when you first jump in is going to shock every nerve in your body. But if I commit to it the night before, then I'm more likely to hold myself accountable to that goal. So that's kind of how I begin the day. Ending the day for me is all about putting things back in the right place and priming my environment for the day following. So obviously, I've got kids, they've got so many toys. Like, we've got toys in every room in our house, but it's very important to me that everything goes back into some form of order at the end of the day. So we pick those things up, we make sure that the sink doesn't have dishes in it. We'll take the trash out. And then for me, it is preparing for the next day. So that's everything from creating that list of goals that I told you about before, to making sure that my gym clothes are ready to go, that my breakfast is set out. And I feel like that in a lot of ways locks in some of those good decisions. If I don't set out my bowl with my oatmeal and my protein shake the night before, then I'm more likely in the morning to react to that desire that I feel to go get fast food or do whatever that might be. In the same way, if my gym clothes aren't out the night before and I have to get up in the dark and search for like a pair of gym shorts or a pair of socks, I'm much more likely to say, it's not worth it. I'm just going to go back to bed. But by priming my environment ahead of time, I'm able to get up in the morning, not think about what I'm going to eat, not think about what I'm going to wear to the gym. All of those things have a place, they've been set aside ahead of time. And so I just go and follow through on those actions.
I love that. I'm gonna start planning my day because I'm writing to complete. I don't have a to-do list. I named it like to complete list, but it's mostly things I want to do. But I like just almost like planning the day of
Hmm.
what. When is your birthday?
My birthday is July 13th.
Okay, July 13th. So you are a Cancer?
I guess so, yeah. I need to get more
Okay.
familiar with the different, yeah.
I don't know. I'm not like really deep into astrology, but on a surface level, I'm always curious to because you are so organized, and I was like, who is he?
Hmm.
Because you love the organization.
Yeah, and let me point out, I haven't always been that way. And so for someone who is listening to
Okay,
this and
so
they
it's not
think, well,
natural for you.
no, I don't think that it is. I think that it's something that once I've embraced it, I've recognized all of the benefits that it offers, but I definitely wasn't this way as a child or as a teenager to the extent that I am now. It really happened in college. My first internship, I worked with a boss who was incredibly organized, and I guess it sort of rubbed off on me. But once I put those things into place, it impacted my studies. I made all A's for the first time after working with him and seeing how organized he was. I was able to get involved with some different, leadership capacities and things at the school where I went. I think it improved my physical health as well because I was tracking, what I was eating. I was tracking the, workouts that I was doing. And so I just over time recognized all of those benefits of getting things down on paper, not being able to, because our brains can only hold so much information, right? And we've got different levels of like short term and long term memory. But what I found, and technology empowers this in so many ways, if I can get something down on paper, or if I can get it on a note in my phone, the responsibility of remembering that no longer falls onto me. I've got a device that can do it for me. And so I try to write everything down. I try to set it up in a way that is easy to follow, easy to refer to. So that's been really helpful for me. I want to add one other thing about planning your day, which I guess falls under the category of self promotion, but I think that it's genuinely helpful for anyone. So if you go to my website, bradyross.com, you can join my email list. I send out midweek motivation every Tuesday, or I guess I call it midweek momentum. But once you do that, you'll get a free download of the introduction and the first chapter of my book, 7 Steps to Dominate Your Day and Crush Your Goals. The first chapter is all about how I plan my days to lock in better progress, lock in better momentum. And so I even have application questions in there about how you can do that in the most effective way possible. So anyone, whether it's you or one of your listeners that wants to do a better job of planning their days, go check that out.
I was planning to ask that question later throughout the conversation, but even now, like you mentioned your website. It will be down in the show notes. Where can people find you? Where can people connect to you? Can you mention the name of the book one more time? Where can people find the book? And I don't know, what are some ways that you bring value today so people know if they want to hire you as a coach? Do you have any programs?
Yeah. So You mentioned my website will be in the show notes. That's where I post all of my content. You can find the link to my book on Amazon there. You can also join my email list, and you'll get not only a free preview of the book, but you'll also get weekly emails from me. I call it my midweek momentum newsletter. The goal is to help you finish the week with the same amount of passion and drive that you started with. I also have a podcast called Motivation for Regular People. We have different guests that come on that talk about their story and how they approach motivation. Really, the goal of what I'm doing right now is to help people who don't feel naturally inclined to motivation or discipline recognize that it's not just something that's reserved for some people and not for others, but it's something that everyone can unlock and everyone can tap into. I am a associate certified coach with the International Coaching Federation, so I have coaching clients that I work with. I've got one framework that centers around self care and leadership. We talk about knowing yourself, caring for yourself, and leading yourself. I've also got a coaching framework based around the book. That one is a little more about how we unlock the power and potential of every day through things like planning your day, exercise, learning, things like that. But yeah, I would encourage people to check out my website, join the email list, listen to the podcast. Those are all free ways to interact with my material. And then the book is also available as well. So, and if you want to connect with me, I've got a page on my website where you can do that as well. I'm admittedly not the most active on social media. That was kind of an intentional thing for my own mental health, but I check my email. You can email me through my website, and I would love to talk more about motivation and goals with anyone who's interested in discussing those things further.
I love that. What is your favorite? Because you mentioned like 10, 15 years ago, you wouldn't have thought certain things that you are thinking right now. What is your favorite? I know it's a hard question to like name just one. You're gonna just name maybe two or three. What is your favorite discovery throughout the years that literally changed your life and made like huge impact on how you live your life? Something,
Hmm.
the aha moment maybe that you had like, oh my God, like everything has changed. Or maybe it was a small moment. It doesn't have to be a big
Hmm.
moment.
Yeah. So I'm trying to decide if I want to mention something like more personal, like in terms of something that I experienced, or something a little more in terms of like lessons I've learned along the way. I think the first thing that comes out in my mind, which is reflected in my story and the preview of my book, that is the introduction in the first chapter that you can access for free. I tell a lot of my story in there as well. And sort of the thesis behind that is that I realized success is not reserved for people who are lucky. It belongs to anyone who is willing to work for it. So, this is kind of a funny example, but at the time that we're recording, Ted Lasso is about to start releasing episodes of season 3. And I know that's a show that a lot of people watch and a lot of people are excited about. So, yesterday I was riding my bike trainer. I was home with my daughter who was taking a nap, and I couldn't actually take my bike out for a ride, but I put it on the trainer and I was rewatching the last episode from season 2 to get ready for season 3 to release. And there was a quote. There's so many good quotes in Ted Lasso, but this one stood out so much that I'm actually thinking about setting it as a recurring reminder on my phone so I can see it frequently. But Ted tells the team that it's our choices, not our abilities, that show who we truly are. And I think that's important for all of us to remember, because not only does it encourage a greater sense of agency in terms of how we live our life and how we move forward, but it also puts the responsibility back onto ourselves. Another thing that I mentioned in that introduction to my book is that I was very avoidant of taking responsibility for the situation where I was in life. It was easy to blame genetics, or it was easy to blame things that were outside of my control for the situation where I found myself. But looking back now, I recognize I was always in control. I was always in the driver's seat. I was just making choices that didn't encourage progress, but they kept me locked into that more limited state where I was before. And so I think as people realize, as the quote says, that you are defined by your choices and not by your abilities, they begin to realize, I may not be the best public speaker, I may not be the smartest person or the most disciplined person in the world, but I can take charge of my life and I can take steps that may not, make me the most impactful, most influential person who has ever lived, but they will help me reach my potential. And that's the only goal that all of us can have. I'm never going to be Michael Jordan. As much as I love basketball, I'm never going to do certain things in life, but I have a potential that through my actions and the way that I think about myself and the way that I imagine the future, I can reach that potential if I'm intentional about the decisions that I make today.
I love that. And I think, do you remember when you were saying like the example of if someone wants to go to do a workout and they feel like, oh, I'm so lazy, I always do this, they can also apply that to themselves. It's not that they have this thought of I am lazy. It's what choice will do they make by wake like not hitting the snooze button and then going to a workout. Because sometimes you can judge ourselves by the thoughts that we have. Or I don't want to do this, or I don't feel motivated. But if we just judge ourselves by the choices that we make, we can feel so much better about ourselves.
Hmm.
So I
Yeah, and
like
even
that.
making the sorry to interrupt, but even making the small shift with that terminology, moving from "I am lazy" to "I'm choosing to be lazy," that's still not the most positive self-talk in the world, but I see more of an open door with that phrase. "I'm choosing to be
Of
lazy."
course, yeah.
Okay, what does that mean? What other choice is possible there? If you acknowledge that
Hmm.
you're making that choice, you also acknowledge the opportunity to make a different choice. And as James Clear says, every action is a vote for the type of person that we want to be. So,
Hmm.
by your choices, by your actions, what type of person are you seeking to become?
And what I also do that might be helpful for people is like I say I have this thought that obviously not this, but since we are on this example, for example, if I thought I was lazy, I would have think like I have this thought that I'm a lazy person, and almost it detaches you, and you realize that it just thought, it just a thought. You are not a lazy person. It just a thought. So I love that. If before I ask you to leave me with a message, is there anything? Obviously, motivation and habits and goal setting is a huge topic. Even like reading the book of like Atomic Habits won't do it all, because and it's an amazing book, but there are so many things out there, so we have to just keep talking for hours if we want to fully cover the topic.
Hmm.
But is there anything you just feel like it's important to add to this conversation, but I just didn't get the chance to ask you the question?
So it doesn't directly connect with motivation. I think that it can impact motivation, but we've talked a lot in this episode about self talk, about limiting beliefs. I remember a conversation I had with a friend about 3 years ago, and I don't even remember how we got into this, but it was the idea that you walk into a room and you feel like all eyes are on you because of your limitations and because of your inadequacies. And it's true that we see those things better than anyone. You walk into a situation, whether it's with one person, whether it's a group of people, and it's easy to think about how you don't measure up. I don't have as much experience as the other people here. I don't have the same knowledge or the same skills as the other people here. And we see those things because we know ourselves in a very deep way. The reality is, when we walk into that room, other people don't notice our insecurities because they're too busy thinking about their own. We all bring baggage, we all bring negative experiences and memories into our relationships and into our interactions. And I don't think that we need to ignore those things necessarily, because I think that there is a lot of opportunity for learning and growth there. But I think that we are kidding ourselves and we're doing a lot of internal damage if we ever begin to believe that we're the only person who ever has those thoughts. And so that's kind of been a recurring theme throughout our conversation. And it's something that I wanted to mention, again, towards the end. You are not the only person who ever feels inadequate. You are not the only person who ever feels like they don't measure up. That's something that we all face on a regular basis. But you can, stay in that frame of thinking and say, well, that's just the way that I am, and I'm never going to change and I'm never going to improve. Or you can adopt this greater sense of control and agency that we've talked about, and you can spend less time focusing on where you currently are and more time focusing on where you want to be in the future or how you want to grow.
I like that. If you would leave me and the listeners, it can be one word, few sentences, book, movie, quote, I don't know, anything that inspires you, but a message that is in your heart and soul right now, what would it be?
Hmm, that's a good question. I don't know why this book came to mind as you started talking, but I'm just going to respond to this impulse and share it. So it's called The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. And in this book, he talks about how struggles, how challenges are not something that we should avoid, but something that we should face head on, because it is those detours and those roadblocks and those challenges that will lead us down the road of success that we're destined to follow. And so he talks about, people from Theodore Roosevelt to Abraham Lincoln to a lot of names that people will recognize, and how their trials that they faced made them the people who they are today. And so I would encourage everyone to think about, because we're all facing trials right now. I've heard it said that everyone is either in the middle of a hard time, coming out of a hard time, or about to go into a hard time. And I would say, don't mourn that, don't avoid that, but think about how that can contribute to your growth and development and serve you for, the foreseeable future.
Love that. Thank you so much for being part of the show. Thank you so much, first of all, for being obsessed with this topic in a good way. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for being like open and vulnerable, and also having all of this knowledge and just learning more and more and sharing it with us.
Absolutely. And I would just end by saying, I'm still a learner in this too. I am
Yeah.
not a master of motivation.
You
I
are
don't have
so
it all figured
humble.
out. Well, I try to be, but it's true.
I know it's true, but you know so much. You know way more than majority of the people. So
Well,
you
I
are
appreciate it.
kind of like an expert.
That's
Okay, let's put it this way. In my mind, in my eyes, you are an expert.
well, that's
So
very
that
encouraging. I appreciate it.
and just thank
Seriously,
you for
thank
your
you.
time. No, that's what I mean. And stop. Okay, not don't stop. You can do whatever you want. None of my business. You can be humble, but like you just like, because sometimes the way we see other people, as you were saying, they don't see themselves that way. So for me, you know so much, and you're an expert. So
Hey, that's a great application to conclude what we've talked about. So thank you,
exactly.
not only on my behalf, but on the behalf of everybody listening to this.
And thank you for listeners for being here, and have a phenomenal rest of the day or night wherever you are. And until next time.